Greetings. Welcome to our digital study of the Book of Esther. This study is meant to, in some ways, complement our in-person version of this study that meets Wednesdays at 1 p.m. at the church. It is also just a standalone study that you can interact with and watch the videos and read along with the book and hopefully gain some appreciation for the Book of Esther. If I can get people who want to engage in a live chat, we will do that. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat underneath the video, and that we will try to monitor that and ask or answer questions in future videos. So if there are things you want to talk about or ask about, please go ahead and message us, and we will try to answer that. Let's begin with an introduction to the Book of Esther. The book is obviously about a woman named Hadassah or Esther, and it was probably written somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 BC to maybe down to 200 BC. Remember, before Jesus' birth, when we count BC, we always count kind of backwards. We're counting down to Jesus' birth, not up after Jesus' birth. So from about 200 or 400 BC down to about 200 BC is probably when this was written. The events of the book take place somewhere around 500 BC, maybe a little bit after that in the 490s or 480s. But the actual writing, we have some context clues in the book itself that help us to understand that it's probably written somewhat later than the events described, or the events as they are described. When we approach the book, we have to very much keep in mind that there is history and there is story in this book. This is not, we can pretty well say, this is not a word-for-word description of the events as they happened. The author of the book has put a little bit of flair into the book, a little bit of style at the very least, so that we can better appreciate the moral of the story. There's just too much in this book that's stylized to expect that it is 100% pure history. First off, we know this because of the name of one of the main characters, the king, Ahasuerus in Hebrew. There is no Persian king named Ahasuerus. There never was. This is a name that is unique to this book. And as Adele Berlin has pointed out in her commentary, the name probably is meant to resemble the Persian word for headache. And so this is a pseudonym for King Headache, which accurately describes this king. He is kind of a buffoon. He's drunk a lot in the book. He very infrequently makes decisions on his own. In fact, only once in the book does he make a decision on his own. This is, in some ways, a lampoon of the character. And so we understand that the author is creating some of this book as a way to help us understand the events. It is not a chronicle of the events. It is rather the author's retelling of this, recasting of events in a story format. I say that in part because this book is meant to be read at the Feast of Purim. The Feast of Purim is meant to be a celebration. It is a raucous celebration. And when you're at a big festive party, you don't want dry, boring history read. I say that as somebody who studied a lot of history. You don't want a historian's approach. You want a story. You want good times, and that is what the Book of Esther offers the readers. The good times, the stories. And we need to appreciate that as such. So when you are approaching this book, ask yourself constantly how much of this is history and how much of it is a story. It is meant to shine a light on the Feast of Purim. And for that reason, I don't think it's completely made up. I have a hard time believing that any author would write a book that is completely made up in order to invent a story behind a feast. I don't see it. Not a religious festival anyway. There could be those times, but I do think that there is some level of history there. Was Esther a queen of the entire Persian Empire? I'm probably going to go with no. Was there a woman who did something miraculous to save a community of Jews? I would say possibly. That sounds like a reasonable assumption, where a woman who is married to a high-ranking official stepped in and did something that was miraculous with the help of God to save her people. I say that because stories, other histories that we have from Greek sources and other places talk about the Persian court, and this story seems somewhat implausible, although there are commentators who will say that there are events within the life of Xerxes that might align to this. So do I say that there is no history? No. Do I say it's complete history? No. It's probably a historical or a fictionalized history that helps us to understand the role of God. And with that said, let's talk about the role of God. This is one of the two books of the Bible that does not mention God once, the other one being Song of Songs. There is no mention of God. There is no mention of prayer. There is no mention of the Israelite covenant. The only religious language we have in the Hebrew version of Esther is in her promise to fast. Fasting and prayer usually go hand in hand, but even then, it's not explicit, at least in the Hebrew version. And this, I should bring in, there are two very different books when we talk about Esther. One is the Hebrew version that was originally written in Hebrew, probably outside of Jerusalem, but maybe inside of Jerusalem, but it was written in Hebrew. The other version we have comes from Egypt. It's part of the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Hebrew scriptures, the Greek translations. The Greek version of Esther has more to it than the Hebrew version, including several prayers. Scholars have their own theories about why the book of Esther might not have prayers in the Hebrew, including the idea that at the Feast of Purim, you are supposed to get so drunk that you cannot distinguish between blessed be Mordecai and cursed be Haman. And at a religious festival where you are supposed to be that intoxicated, or, have that good of a time, there's a theory that the writer of the Hebrew version would not have wanted people to have the opportunity to blaspheme God by mistake, and so did not write God or prayers or anything religious, explicitly religious, into the book in order to keep people from accidentally blaspheming. They did write them into the Greek version, so I don't know about that. Maybe not. The Greek version may be completely independent of the Hebrew version, or it might have been somebody wrote the Hebrew version and the Greek author went, well, this thing needs some prayers, and wrote prayers into it. It also might be that the author of the Hebrew version of Esther wanted very explicitly to tell a story of Jews who had not come home after the exile. These are people who intentionally, for whatever reason, maybe they couldn't afford it or weren't able to, or had good jobs, but they intentionally stayed behind when the people of Judah were allowed to go back home by King Cyrus, some 25 years before the events of this book. So these are people who stayed in exile. And there is possibly some truth to the idea that the author of Esther wanted us to see God in the background, even when the people aren't terribly concerned about God. Even when when prayer and the covenant and things of what we would consider a religious nature aren't especially important to the people, and they are focused on their people group, their family, their ancestry, their culture, but not the religious elements of life, even then, God is able to work through them and with them. And that has some really good things to say to us in a day and age where we look around and increasingly our society is secular. How does God work even in the midst of that culture? So keep that in mind as you are reading the book. There is this insider-outsider identification. Who is part of the people of God? What does that mean to be a part of the people of God? We are going to identify with God's people, but what does that mean? Is Esther part of God's covenant people? If so, why? And what does that mean for her and for Mordecai? Just something to think about as you're reading this book. Also look at humility and pride and how arrogance is just on display everywhere. Everybody is arrogant. And how does pride lead to the downfall of people? And how does humility, once learned, bring people up? And a great example of this is how Esther's character kind of changes once she fasts. Once she humbles herself in fasting, her character changes from somebody who is, well, kind of arrogant and proud to somebody who is truly great. And this idea of humbling ourselves before God and then being exalted. So there is that dynamic. There's also a dynamic of the power structure between men and women. From the first chapter and the first story between Ahasuerus and Vashti all the way through to the end, we see this kind of give and take and power structure that the Persians have created, and how there's tension between men and women, and how are we supposed to live in that tension and work through that tension? What is truly kind of the way men and women are meant to relate? And so look at that, plus the way that power is undermined, how the king is perpetually powerless. That is one of these ironic, humorous twists of Esther. The king is powerless and everybody else has authority and power. Keep that in mind. So as we begin to look at all of this, what I would suggest is try to read through the entire book. It's not terribly long. You could do it easily in a couple of days. You could probably do it in one sitting pretty easily. I think half hour, 45 minutes of reading, and you should probably be done with the book of Esther. Read over it. Think about a couple of the things that you notice. Ask yourself some questions about how you see the power dynamics, how you see God interacting. Think about what questions come to your mind. Ask those in our chat. Get in contact with us so that I can kind of frame these videos to address some of the issues that come up. And I look forward to being with you over the next several weeks as we post videos about the book of Esther. So thank you. Have a great day.